Greetings and welcome back, and welcome to the first mini lecture on the Constitution. So we've moved out of chapter one. Now we're moving into chapter two. And the title, as you can see on your lecture notes, are Constitutions and Constitutionalism. And a lot of people make the assumption that the two are synonymous, that they're the same thing, that a constitution and constitutionalism is the same thing. And people make an even bigger mistake, in my opinion, and that is that they believe that the word constitution and democracy are synonymous. And so, for example, a lot of people, when they refer to American democracy, will talk about the Constitution. And certainly, in the United States, all of these things are true. We do have a written constitution. We do have constitutionalism, and put some stars there. Uh, it's an important concept. It's something that you're likely to see on the exam. The essence of constitutionalism is the restraint of political power, and certainly that is what we think of when we think about a democracy. But that's not necessarily true. For example, the most model democracy in the world is Great Britain, and Great Britain does not have a single written document that we would call a constitution. They certainly have elements of a constitution, the Magna Carta, which you see in your notes, and I'll refer to in just a minute, the Act of Union, the Parliament Act of 1911 and 1949. So certainly there are parts of a constitution there, but they do not have one single codified document like the United States have. There obviously are a lot of examples of countries that have a written constitution but are not democratic and do not have constitutionalism. For example, Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had a written constitution, but remember, constitutionalism is the restraint of political power. And certainly that constitution did not meaningfully restrain Adolf Hitler's political powers in any way whatsoever. Or you could think about the 1936 constitution that was drafted in the Soviet Union when Joseph Stalin was their leader. Once again, a written constitution but no constitutionalism. There were no restraints on the political power of Joseph Stalin, and millions of people died due to the repression of the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union. So the two are not the same. Constitutions are interesting. They exist in democratic and non-democratic countries. But what we're interested in this section is, how do constitutions, if they're meaningful, promote constitutionalism? And so you should know that constitutionalism is the restraint of political power. So I mentioned Great Britain, right? Great Britain has had constitutionalism for probably 800 years or so in a more or less formalized way. Mass-based democracy has existed in Britain for less than 200 years. For example, and let me make this a little bit clearer. Let's say that we had a new political community. I'll flatter myself here and call it Randallville. And I'm the leader, so I'm King Richard of Randallville. And I became king because my dad, who also was named Richard, had died. And someday when I die, my son, Ryan, will become king, and so we'll call him King Ryan. So in this case, our political system would be a hereditary monarchy. And of course, in Great Britain, the same royal family has acted as the monarch of Great Britain since 1714, and I will talk about that a little bit later on. Now, just because I'm King Richard does not necessarily mean that we don't have constitutionalism. For example, even though I'm king and we're not a democracy, perhaps we have rules that say I cannot arbitrarily jail any of you as my citizens. That if I accuse you of a crime, you have certain procedures. For example, let's say that you have a right to an attorney. You don't have to testify against yourself in court. These should sound pretty familiar, right? Because we have enshrined these in our Bill of Rights, which I will talk about later. Or maybe even more fundamentally, let's say that I want to take away someone's farm to build a coliseum. I can't just take the land. We might have to have an appraisal, and I, as king, may have to give you just compensation for your private property. So let's say that the appraisers say that your property is worth $1 million. I have to pay you $1 million. So you can have constitutionalism and not be democratic. So, three different concepts: a constitution, a written document. Obviously, our current constitution dates back to the constitution that was drafted in 1787 with 27 formal amendments and a whole bunch of informal amendments by Supreme Court decision, etc. We have constitutionalism. We have restraints on political power. For example, the most meaningful event when I was in high school, this event called Watergate. And certainly the notion of constitutionalism, a written constitution, and a Sony 800B tape recorder led to the resignation of the most powerful man in the world, Richard Nixon. And so in the United States, Watergate and the forced resignation of a president is an example of constitutionalism. So I think I beat that concept in the ground. Let's move down to your concept of 1A, the Magna Carta. I would just add a word or two here to your notes if you're following along. In the notes, it says Magna Carta 1215. King John signs this document, and I would write the word feudal document, Feudal, feudal document, restraining his power and recognizing certain rights of the landed aristocracy. And usually, a lot of people make the comment that the Magna Carta is really the first mass-based democratic document written in the English language. First of all, it wasn't mass-based. We're talking about the rights of a very small group of people, the landed aristocrats. And certainly there were meaningful restraints on the power of the king, certain property rights, the right to a trial by one's peers, and some of the things that we take for granted today. I added a line because very few books will note this, but I think it's much more significant. Everyone talks about, wow, a king formally in writing put limits on his political power 800 years ago. Certainly that is a meaningful event, but to me what's intriguing is that every English king for nearly 400 years recognized those limitations. And finally, in the 17th century, in the 1600s, when we have some kings who decide that they don't want to go by that long-standing agreement, that there is this power sharing or balance of power between the aristocrats and the monarch, and these monarchs in the 1600s start claiming divine right and claim that there are no limitations on their power. We have an epic civil war, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. So, England is a remarkable country. They share some things with the United States in terms of not having menacing neighbors. Great Britain has not been successfully invaded since the Normans, these French-speaking people, successfully invaded Britain in 1066. So in Great Britain, the country has been allowed to, in a very slow, very evolutionary way, develop democratic institutions and values in constitutionalism. If you look at the other countries throughout Europe, these countries were all forced to create political systems under the pressure of military defeat. That is not true for Britain. It's obviously not true for the United States. So when the Normans took over England, they engaged in this power sharing with the local elites called feudalism. And so there was this informal tradition of power sharing, but the Magna Carta is what you should know here. You should know constitutionalism is the restraint of political power. That's a test question. You should know that the Magna Carta was a feudal document recognizing certain rights of the landed aristocracy. Now, democratic institutions, and they weren't democratic at the time, Parliament, uh, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Today, we usually refer to Parliament as just being the House of Commons. The Parliament, which would be the British equivalent of our Congress, originally began in the 13th century as a forum to raise revenue for the crown. Wars are very expensive. Certainly in the United States, we have seen how costly wars can be in the Middle East, where we've been engaged now for decades. In Britain, they engaged in a war with the French called the Hundred Years' War that lasted on and off for 114 years. So think about that. Think about your country being engaged in warfare over this 114-year period or so. The king would continuously, or at least regularly, go to the aristocrats for money, for manpower to go fight these wars. And while the aristocrats said, okay, that's fine, we will do that, but we want things in return. We want power. We want title. And certainly Parliament over time became gradually more powerful, and the king much, became much weaker. Now, I didn't write this down in your notes because I'm not going to test you on it, but certainly I would point out that there were other things that led to the rise of the aristocrats becoming more powerful and eventually taking over the political system. There was a king in England in the 16th century. His name was Henry VIII. You may be aware of Henry VIII. This is a king that had a problem with the ladies in his life. Henry VIII was married to a Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, and of course, he accused her or blamed her for not giving him a male heir. She actually did give him one male heir, and he died as a child. And so he wanted a divorce, and of course, the Catholic Church would not allow this. So Henry VIII went to the Parliament and asked them to get rid of the Catholic Church as the official Church of England, to create a new church called the Anglican Church, the Church of England. And the aristocrats said, that's fine, we'll do that. However, you have to go public and you have to declare us your equal. This was a huge concession, but Henry agreed. And so with Henry VIII, we now have a political system in which the landed aristocrats and the monarch are equals. Henry, of course, dies with no male heir, and as it turns out, his daughter Elizabeth I, many historians rank as the greatest monarch in British history. I frankly have a fondness for Queen Victoria, which until Queen Elizabeth, our current queen in England, who has been Queen of England now for, 67 years. Queen Victoria was queen for 64 years, and she had the record before Queen Elizabeth. She turned out to be a great queen. England became a world power in exploration, and unfortunately, when she died, there was no heir. And so we get a new group of kings and queens called the Stuarts. And the Stuarts said, we're not doing constitutionalism. We're not doing power sharing. We're ruling by divine right. And the result of that is that there was a civil war that ensued. The Civil War personally impacted my life. And certainly I will talk about the impact on England and my life later on.